Wendy Edwards, I'm chair of the Visual Arts Department here at Brown. Thank you so much for coming. And if you were at the History of Art and Architecture luncheon yesterday, just please forgive me for a moment for repeating my very personal connection with Ruth Fine, but it might be fun for others to hear. I believe it's really important for students to stay in contact with faculty for numerous reasons. And Ruth and I are what I consider to be a really good example of how an academic relationship between individual artists can guide one's path through their life. As my mentor, Ruth taught a drawing class at the Philadelphia College of Art during a high school summer program I attended when I was 17 years old. And I was also a burgeoning hippie at that time. And remember that the 60s were a very turbulent time. And there was a lot of unrest on college campuses. And thinking back, it was much more turbulent then than it is now. But there is sort of this connection that I'm feeling sort of very strongly, over the past few weeks. Ruth was in her early 20s, and she just completed degrees in printmaking at both the Philadelphia College of Art and the University of Pennsylvania, where she got her MFA degree. She wore white go-go boots and had long black hair parted down the middle. And as a teacher, she was tough and mesmerizingly devoted to drawing. While still teaching, she went on to work with the Rosendale collection of prints and illustrated books, which in turn led to the curatorial prints position at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C., where she worked on numerous exhibitions and catalogs of note for 4 decades. Among those artists she was working with was Jasper Johns, Helen Frankenthaler, Romero Bearden, Roy Lichtenstein, John Marin, and George O'Keeffe, many of our favorites. Her most recent projects include The Art of Norman Lewis for the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Art, which she'll be talking about today, and a catalog essay for Martin Puryear, Multiple Dimensions for the Art Institute of Chicago. And you're all familiar with Brown's Slavery Memorial on the green by Puryear. Among numerous awards and boards, Ruth is chair of the Lichtenstein Foundation Board, and she's a practicing artist. Please help me welcome Ruth Fine.
I never had white go-go boots. I don't believe I had white go-go boots. Anyway, it's nice to have a number of old and new friends in this room, and I always like to have friends around. So Norman Lewis. Norman Lewis was born in 1909, and he died in 1979. And the image on the left is from 1945, and keep in mind the striped shirt because it will come up later. The image on the right is from sometime in the 70s. Almost everything about Norman Lewis, even after trying to figure out a lot for about 20 years, there are just more question marks than there are solid answers about this extremely wonderful artist. But because we had a great team working on this exhibition that I did for Pennsylvania Academy, we know a lot more than we used to know. But there are a lot of question marks still. And in the center is a 1949 drawing. And I first knew Lewis because of his drawings, which I think are some of the most remarkable drawings of the 20th century in America for sure, and maybe any place. And I don't know exactly how it's made, but I think it's made with rollers. I think it's a self-portrait. As far as I know, it was never reproduced until the book that went with the exhibition. And the sense of experimentation in his works on paper is what really drew me to him in the first place. Lewis was, he had a complicated life. He truly straddled both the world of Harlem and the downtown world of the larger New York art community. He was born in Harlem. He died in a hospital in Harlem, although he did move downtown in about 1967, which radically changed the scale at which he was able to make his art. But although he said he never studied with Augusta Savage, he is listed in many, many places as having been her student and showing in exhibitions of her students. And she was one of the primary teachers in Harlem in the 20s and 30s. And he also taught at the Harlem Community Arts Center and was a student at the Harlem Community Arts Center. And so he took full advantage of all of the programs that were available uptown in New York. But at the same time, he was very engaged with the downtown community, starting with issues that had to do with union situations, union rights, but also art school. He taught at the Thomas Jefferson, no, it's not the Thomas Jefferson, the Jefferson School, which was a left-wing school in the 40s. And one of his students there was a woman that would become the artist Ad Reinhardt's wife. And in fact, it was Norman Lewis that introduced Ad Reinhardt to his wife, and this is their daughter. And it's quite remarkable. Her name is now Rita Reinhardt Bedford, but she was on one of the Kinder trains out of Germany in the 30s and went to London and then came to this country. And she talks with great love about Norman Lewis and how important he was to welcoming her to the United States, that he was a profoundly important influence on her art and as a friend, obviously. And she's a wonderful painter herself, now in her early 80s, one of those artists' wives who's less well known than the artists who are male. So he taught downtown in the 40s and 50s, and he was teaching at the Art Students League throughout the 1970s. And it was wonderful kind of reconnecting with his students from the Art Students League, because he obviously had an amazing impact on the students that he taught there, both black and white. Lewis is way better known in the African American community than he has been in the wider art community, and hopefully this exhibition will change things a little bit. I don't have the image here, but he's the one African American artist in a 1950 Studio 35 meeting of abstract expressionist artists, and he was always tied to and connected to Reinhardt the closest, but other artists of that generation as well. The exhibition I did was in 6 parts, and this lecture is kind of organized to take you through the exhibition, which started with a section called In the City that had 3 sections in it. The first one was in the city looking at art, and these very amazing pastel drawings, one on sandpaper. I know of about 8 of them. There may have been more. He apparently did go to the Museum of Modern Art in 1935 when the African Negro art exhibition was there, and drew in the gallery. He talked, and when I say he talked, it's based on a few oral histories that are available. And he talked about going to MoMA once a week for his early life, just to study the art. And I always felt that the fact that he said he didn't learn from anybody, that he was self-taught, was because I think that the work of his education that meant the most to him was the part he gave himself. He speaks in these interviews about spending, about gambling. He was a big gambler, among the other things he did to earn money, but he talks about gambling in order to buy books for his library, and his library was quite extensive, art across the board, and apparently at one point he had a very extensive political library as well, but that has since disappeared. Anyway, these are for me, these show what an extraordinary, talented man he was, that he really could do whatever he wanted to do in terms of skill issues. But my feeling about him is that he always was, that the primary thing he was interested in throughout his life was the process of making art and how he used materials. And one of the reasons I think Louis is not as well known as he might be, obviously he was African American and there were issues of racial prejudice, but beyond that, he's not an artist who ever got a, who never eyed at a singular image. You'll see as we go along that there are always multiple ways that he worked simultaneously. And I think that, so people would say to me, oh, he's all over the map. And the argument that I always felt kept him from being all over the map was very much the notion that it was about how you work and how materials work and how they function. The drawings, I think, are, they're scattered throughout here. And the exhibition I did at its largest, which was in Philadelphia, it's now at the Chicago Cultural Center, and it has about 62 works in it. In Philadelphia, it had 92 paintings and unique works on paper and 30, and a separate exhibition of his prints. And I do have some prints in here to show you. This was the year after those African masks, and the painting on the left, which is his, has been misdated in its publication on many occasions, and it's been dated as 1946. And when I started telling people, well, no, it's actually dated on the painting 1936, 46 had to be a typo, people said, well, he wasn't working like that. And the truth is there is nothing but this painting that I've seen that is as abstract as this. But it, for me, resonates very closely and with the painting that is on the right, which is a Kandinsky painting that was in an exhibition at MoMA the year after the African show. And I think you can see the kinds of shapes that are going on here, the kinds of color, the wheels that happen in here, these circular forms. This is not a copy by any stretch of the imagination. But when you look long and hard and close at it, this kind of castle-like building here and castle-like building there, it seemed clear to me that he was looking at Kandinsky, and that's yet further his looking at art. And he was very, very interested in Van Gogh, who often signed his paintings Vincent, and Norman often signed his work Norman. And there are thematic resonances between the two of them, but this seemed to me to be the easiest one to make a case for. Very small, powerful, beautifully articulated canvas by Louis. One of the things that in the African American community seemed very important was among his collectors. I knew his works on paper for many, many years, but I did a Romeo Bearden show in 2003 it was on, and so from about 1999 on, I was looking at art, and there was not one serious African-American collector of African-American art that didn't have a Norman Lewis painting, and that didn't speak of him with immense pride as the artist that took on abstraction as a young man and stayed with it until the end of his life, which is true. He did many other things as well. But I think that some of the early figurative works, he's categorized often as a social realist, which I think is totally not right. I think he was never really interested in realism at all. If you just, if you just look at the kind of abstract forms that are happening in this drawing of the figure or in this painting, both of which were done the same year, I think you can get a sense that he's really not trying to be a realist. So his early work is miscategorized, and his late work, in a way, is miscategorized. He was involved with the abstract expressionists, but that was certainly not all he did. He did a body of prints. I'm told that Lewis did about 2,000 unique works. I've seen about 1,300. The 2,000 number comes from the daughter of his widow, Rita Lewis, a woman named Taryn Fuller, who takes care of the estate very, very well and who was immensely helpful to me. And there's also a body of prints. We found about 37, 38, so my guess is there are about 40. They're done in batches. Some of them are done in the 30s, like the one that's here, and they're also scattered through. And while I wouldn't make a case that the print is a copy of the painting, it certainly is in reverse of the painting, which is what would have happened if you did a lithograph on stone and then printed it. And the early prints are pretty consistently lithographs, and later on he got involved with etchings. I want to just make a note of how large this drawing is. It's 36 by 24, almost the same size as the painting, and that's a quite large painting. The painting in the middle, The Wanderer, it's a quite large drawing, sorry. The painting in the middle, Johnny the Wanderer, is always cited as being a painting that was shown at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in the 30s. And of course, you can't find any reference in the Met records of exhibitions in the galleries to a painting by Norman Lewis in the 30s being on the walls. But in fact, it was shown in the education galleries at the Met and won a prize of $10. And he was always kind of winning prizes on the one hand and being left out of exhibitions on the other because of this kind of not quite fitting in. But it's kind of great to think of that as being at the Met in the 30s. The painting on the left here is the painting that was the most exhibited painting during his lifetime, and I think further evidence of his interest in Cubism from very early in his career. But at any time where I found a representational painting exhibited once he became an abstract artist, which was about 1945, it's this one. It's sometimes called Girl with Yellow Hat, it's sometimes called Woman with Yellow Hat, it's sometimes called Yellow Hat. But it seems not only to have the kind of layered form that Cubist painting would have, but also shows evidence of his interest in the Mexican mural painters, which was high in New York at the time. But as he moved on, in addition to being interested in Kandinsky, I think for me, one of the people who was most important to him was Gorky, and the kind of moving out of color from the line that one saw in Gorky's paintings. And there are articles that he cut from magazines. He has a marvelous reference library which shows the range of his artistic interests and also shows the range of his political interests. He always talked about the fact that he stopped being a representational painter because he didn't see the point of being a representational painter, a political painter. That the way to be a political activist was to be an activist, and that art was art and politics was politics. I think the work doesn't bear that out, as you'll see a little bit later, but that's what he said. But his files are filled with articles he cut from newspapers and magazines and extensively annotated that have to do with racial instances in the country. He was also known as a fashion plate, and I pointed out to you the striped shirt, which will come up again. But the details of clothing, the neckties, everyone having a different hat, her wonderful face eyelashes, the pattern of the dress that's here but not here. So he's not being literal at all. And one of the interesting things for me is that any painting I've seen of Lewis that has multiple figures, the skin color of every one of them varies. There's never a painting where the same skin color. So he was kind of always engaging the complexity of racial issues in his work, despite what he said. Another example, of a watercolor that's dated on one side. This is a recto verso of the same sheet of paper, where you're seeing him kind of caricaturing the beatings and horror of this. And of course, when you see this now with what we see on television, it's pretty extraordinary that things haven't changed very much. The painting on the right is a horizontal, so that you can't like frame this and show it with both of them in their proper orientation. But he was actually sent by the WPA to the South in the 30s to set up a school in the Carolinas. He didn't stay very long, but there are a number of landscapes that seem to come from that time, and a few of them are dated. Much of his work is not dated, and it's not easy to know when it was done. He did various objects that, at first I thought this was a mask in the center, and then you realize that no head, not even a child's head, would fit into it. But he was involved with three-dimensional form, and I have a few others. This kind of scarification that he would have seen on African sculpture, which was very important to him, takes place in some of his drawings and some of his paintings during that period. And he was involved with caricature a bit, and very close to an artist named William Steig. He was one of the members of a group called 306 that met in Harlem in the 30s. That was a multiracial group, but it included musicians and writers and cartoonists. And William Steig, if you kind of look at the books of his work, you see a kind of connection between Lewis's caricature and Steig's caricature. But this was why I wanted you to remember the striped shirt, because he's always described by his friends as being very dapper and wearing a striped shirt and wearing a boater hat. And again, he made these objects that I thought were puppets until I really examined them, and they're not puppets. Nobody knows when they were made, or nobody I found knows when they were made or why they were made. And there are about 5 of these doll-type figures here. And this one is thought to be a self-portrait. As a young man, he worked for a tailor, and he, throughout his life, made his clothes and clothes for his friends and clothes for his wife, and he did needlepoint. There's even a needlepoint replica of that girl with the yellow hat that he did because his wife said she didn't ever want to part with that painting, and so once the painting got parted with, she had the needlepoint replica of it, beautifully made. I mean, he was an incredible craftsman. And this is about the point where he's moving into abstraction, and I think, again, further suggests the kind of relationship between him and Gorky and the kind of moving of color across the surface that we saw in the Kandinsky as well. The work on paper was not in any way a study, and the Potato Eaters as a possible title comes from the interest in Van Gogh. One of the things that's also important about Lewis is that he is always connecting painting and drawing, that all of the paintings have a large component of drawn elements on them. So you see all the linear work here and all the kind of tonal work here, and very much that's an aspect of his work that he's trying to think about how you make line work in a multiple number of ways. And we think that this probably is his first full abstraction. It's called Composition 1. It's a painting that he was very proud of. This photograph of him was reproduced. The watercolor on the top just shows the way he's echoing with works on paper and on canvas throughout his career, and continues with making drawings, always using the visible world as his source. And I think he never actually gives that up. There are a number of kinds of abstractions he does, but in this case, it's for me clearly the buildings in Harlem that are the sources of what he's looking at, fire escapes and balconies, and this is more literal, so you can really tell it Polo Lounge. But other times, as he moves into abstraction, he's involved with natural elements. So this was the last of the three components of the In the City. It was In the City looking at art, In the City looking at life, which I didn't mention when we were looking at it, and In the City 1945, which was a real transitional year for him, where he started doing figures early in the year and ended doing as abstract as he's going to get. The next section of the show was called Visual Sound. And he's always associated with jazz, but it's interesting to see a painting called Cantata at the bottom, and this very wonderful complex echoes, also an issue of sound. He had a way of drawing a line and then pulling from the line so that thered be a line and then ink would be pulled this way and that way. And this is one of the most complex drawings of that sort. And another example of the kind of connection between the linear work and the painterly work. And three examples of jazz musicians, all done the same year. I think of them as sort of moving from left to right as greater abstraction. The two on the left are the same size, the one on the right is a little bit smaller. And I think the Picasso influence is very much seen in these works. But he would again and again attempt to explore a subject in multiple versions. That's of course not unusual, it's what artists do. But it's interesting to see how he moves into a greater sense of abstraction as he goes along. The next section of the show was called Rhythm of Nature, and I suppose this painting here is one of the greatest examples of sort of the drawn painting. This is a much more spare drawing using that ink technique, and I don't really think you can see it in a slide very well. Again, a large-scale drawing about the same size almost as the painting. And this is a photograph I found in his archives, and I'm assuming that any of the photographs I found in his archives he took. There's no reason to assume someone else did. And so you can see where he's thinking on paper and on canvas and in photography, a kind of record of the things that he's interested in. Oh, sorry. In 1946, he was taken on by an artist named, a dealer named Marion Willard, the Willard Gallery, that lasted for many years after that. He stayed with the Willard Gallery from 46 to 64 or 65, when he got much more involved with the Black Arts movement. And he doesn't exactly say why he leaves the Willard Gallery, but I think there was a feeling that she wasn't doing enough for him. But both on her side and his side, in one of these interviews, he talks about her saying to him, "I really didn't do as well by you as I should have." This is his long-term early girlfriend, who was a psychologist. According to Marion Willard's daughter and Lewis's wife, Junichiro Inakuma, a Japanese artist, at the Willard Gallery, was his closest friend at the gallery. They liked to go fishing together. But I don't know how many of you would have heard of the Willard Gallery, but it really was up there in terms of its importance. He had 6 or 7 one-man shows. And what's amazing is that he was during his lifetime, in 132 group shows. The catalog we did for the show was already outdated. We only could find 130, and then after it was published, we found 2 more. The fourth section of the show, I guess we're at now, was called Ritual. And I think of this procession painting that's on the upper left as being possibly the first one. And 1947 was the year in which the Caribbean Labor Day Parade sort of was given a big play in Harlem, and that's the year this was painted. And of course, he would have seen marches and parades in Harlem for many, many reasons before that. But there's something about the fact that that happened that year and the procession painting started that year, and that was really the reason for the name of the show, Procession, the Art of Norman Lewis. It had two meanings. One is the notion of procession starts in his work at this moment and goes to the end of his life, and the other is the notion of process. So that was the cause of the show. His stick figures are an element that occur in the paintings pretty much from this point on. This is a painting that's in the Albright Knox Museum in New York. Again, a drawing on canvas. And this painting won the Popularity Prize at the Carnegie International in 1955, and the Carnegie International would poll the people who came to see the show for what painting they liked the best. And Lewis's painting was the painting they liked the best. And, you know, Pollock was in the show, and Gottlieb and much more famous artists were in the show, but he got the Popularity Prize. And again, this notion of drawing and painting, the detail at the left is, it shows you much more clearly than the full-scale painting, but it's basically a graphite drawing mixed into wet paint. And it's a very, very beautiful painting, one unlike any other I saw. The Masquerade shows a kind of interest in calligraphy and the brushstroke, and his library contains many books on Japanese and Chinese painting and calligraphy. And so you go from the very thin graphite line to this amazingly thick, loose, painterly mark. That's sort of a funny location, but it is a very long vertical painting, and that was another element of his interest in Japanese and Chinese art, the notion of the scroll. There are many wide horizontal paintings and these long vertical paintings that I think their sources in the scrolls that he would have admired in Asian art. As a young man, he was a merchant marine and traveled around South America, but his one major trip to Europe was in 1957, and that's him on the USS Constitution. And when he came back from Europe, he did Carnivale scenes, starting pretty immediately, the one on the left, and then the one on the right. And I think you can get the sense of the kind of linear quality that is establishing these figures throughout here, whereas these become much more designy, less stick figures than almost toy-like figures. And he collected and made toys and did use them as a source of some of the imagery in his work. But what's interesting to me is I came across many examples of paintings that were related either in their color or their composition, their titles, which linked them together, that were done several years apart. And so it's difficult when paintings are undated to connect them, because there's evidence that he would do something in 58 and do something related in 62. And so this is just an example of some of the etchings he did using the same themes. The one at the top left very much connected to the Masquerade, that wide calligraphic stroke, and the procession, circular dance, stick figure objects here. Most of these were never printed in editions, and most of them have not really been out in the world at all, and are pretty much totally unknown. And so the next section of the show was civil rights, and it seems clear to me that he was engaged with political ideas in his art. I can't imagine anything tougher than the American totem painting. And what was interesting is the drawing on the right was owned by a woman who actually sadly recently died at the age of 59, but when she was a little girl, her father, an architect, was quite friendly with Lewis, and he would take her to Lewis's studio, and he would set her up with an easel and her own paints. And she said, he never told me what to paint, he only told me how to paint. And so this whole idea of the using of materials and what they mean. But she had no idea that this was a Klan subject. She didn't connect the masks. And how she got it was that as a fourth grade student, she wrote a biography of Norman Lewis, which we actually had in the show. And I mean, it was just this darling, handwritten 3-page biography based on a CV that he had given her. And he gave her parents 2 drawings, and he said, give her this one when she's 13. And it was a procession, a kind of happy carnival-y picture. And he said, give her this one when she's 18 and better able to deal with the emotional aspects of it. And this is the one he wanted her to have when she was 18. But even knowing that, she really didn't realize until we were looking at it together what its subject was. Lewis never gave titles as specific as the March on Washington, so I don't trust this title, but it's the title that the owner has. And there's a kind of flag-like quality to it, and it's a way for you to see this kind of layered figures that are happening again and again. It's the most colorful of what I think of as the civil rights paintings. Most of them are black and white or blue and white. This is quite extraordinary. And what's interesting is the last large show of his work before the show we did for the Academy was done by the Studio Museum in Harlem in 1998, and it was called The Black Paintings. And it focused only on the black paintings. And whenever he's been written about since then, it's been said that he's a painter of black paintings. And so one of the things that was important to me with this show was to prove he wasn't a painter of black paintings only. Yes, he did black and white paintings, but he was an amazing colorist. And when he was a young artist, it was as a colorist that he was known. One of the interviews of him was done by a much younger woman painter. And she said to him, well, you're well known as a colorist. Talk about your interest in color. And so I think it was pretty spontaneous. I don't think he had any particular rules of how he did it. But an artist that's doing this is not a painter of black paintings only. But these are the black paintings. He was a member of a group called Spiral that was formed in 1963. He and Romeo Bearden, Ernst Cricklow, Richard Mayhew's the only person still alive. He's in his 90s. Formed the group called Spiral the year of the March on Washington, and their concern was to come to grips with the idea of how artists could be powerful and active in the civil rights movement. They met for a few years. They only had one exhibition. The exhibition was in 1965, and the painting on the right, upper right, is the painting that Lewis had in that show. It had been owned by his wife's mother for many years, and then it got sold, and I couldn't find it. I knew who sold it, but she wasn't willing to let me know who bought it. So it was the one painting I desperately wanted for the exhibition and couldn't get it. So the drawing on the left was my kind of fill-in for the painting on the right, and as a drawings person that was sort of fine, but it just seemed horrible not to be able to have what really was his best known painting in the exhibition, and at the bottom is the catalog for the show. But this kind of very atmospheric abstraction was being done in exactly the same years that he was doing the civil rights paintings. These dates don't necessarily correspond, so you have to believe me. And I recently, after the show was up, came to believe strongly that the one on the top is really based on his looking at water. And I came to that conclusion by looking at a number of John Marin paintings of water, and they're very close. And Lewis was known to be a fisherman, to love to be on the water. The Willard Gallery owners had a place on Long Island Sound, and everyone talked about his love of the water, and I do think that's what it is. But he talked about the importance of fog and light, and I think all of these very soft romantic abstractions that are happening during the civil rights years or the years of the civil rights paintings were, I mean, his way of staying sane. He just needed to think about other things in the work. And also the fact that I think he had a bigger vision. And when I said earlier that he didn't arrive at a set image that people, you think of Rothko, you say Rothko's name, you get an image. You say Pollock's name, you get an image. It doesn't happen with Louis, and I think it has to do with just the complications of his life and his experience. In 1967, I'm going to stop so you can ask questions. In 1967, he bought a loft in a building on Grand Street, and between 69 and 72, he did 9 or 10 paintings that are all approximately this size. Some of them are vertical, some of them are horizontal. They're the largest paintings he did to that point. It was clearly that he had a larger studio so he could make larger paintings. And their range is quite extraordinary. And so the final exhibition of the show was called Summation. And there are a few new things that came into that period of time from 69 until he died, but he also went back and rethought things that he had done earlier, as if by having a larger studio and being able to do it at a larger size, he could rethink what the possibilities were. This is the most landscape-like of them, the brightest of them. Most of them were done in 72. These are two more examples. Very, very tough, beautiful, powerful paintings with the figurative element here, the notion of triumphal, the red and the black, the blood, the fire. Clearly, one can't not think about Klan figures in a picture such as that, with the knowledge of what he was dealing with. And again, just as there was a relationship between the paintings, prints, and drawings in the 30s, in the 70s, there was also a relationship. So New World of Coming is another of that group of 9 or 10 pictures. I know 9, so I'm assuming there has to be one I don't know, but I don't think there were many more than that. And at this point, he was working. As a young man, he printed his own work, and he also printed for other artists. At this point, he was working with the great printmaker Bob Blackburn, who had the printmaking workshop in New York. And so all of the experimental prints he did at the end of his life were done with Bob Blackburn. This is the one thing that changed in the 60s, well, one of two, and I don't have the other one to show, but he started doing works called Sea Change. He did them on paper, he did them on canvas. Most of them are blue and green. He went to Greece in 1973 to visit the artist Jack Whitten, who had a home in Greece. And it was after that that he started doing the Sea Change images. Somebody has found one that they think is dated earlier, but I don't actually think they're right, so we still have to figure that out. But what's interesting to me is the drawing that's on the right that is dated for a variety of reasons from about 1960, and how this notion of the circular form that he didn't really move into until 74, 75 was on his mind in 60. And I think really what that drawing is like a stamp of a soda can repeated, which again I didn't realize till the show was on the walls. His political activism remained. He was one of the people that protested the Harlem on My Mind exhibition. With Bearden and Ernie Cricklow, he founded the Cinque Gallery, which was meant to support the art of young minority artists. And he was very, very involved with the Studio Museum in Harlem, its founding, its programming. He was an advisor to them. And he was really, I mentioned how much his students loved him. Most of his students' names wouldn't mean anything to you, but the painters of the next generation, especially the abstract painters like Sam Gilliam and Melvin Edwards, sculptor, and William T. Williams, talk at great length about the importance of Lewis to them, how he kind of broke the ground as in abstraction, because one of the problems with Lewis is that the African American community really believed solidly that artists of color should be making political statements. And for Norman to, I mean, even though he did make political statements, he said he didn't make them, and he did other things as well. And his working in a more formalist way gave permission to people like Sam and William T. Williams and Mel. And it's a conversation I've had again and again with these people about how much he admired them and how important he was for them. And his supporting the programs at the Studio Museum. These are the works done right before he died. They're both works on paper. I ended the talk with them really to demonstrate that he never really did give up the figure, that was always part of his work, and then that was always part of his problem. People didn't know what to do with these works because they don't fit into an abstract expressionist style, but also the range of how varied they are. Basically the same time, one is monochromatic and very lightly worked, the softest touch. He had the most amazing touch. I mean, you can't tell that kind of thing when you're looking at slides, but they're so beautiful. His relationship between the mark and the paper, and how heavily worked the one on the left is and how lightly worked the one on the right is really critical. And in terms of his influence on people, Herbert Wheeler, I never knew he died. Chester Higgins, who's a great photographer, does work for the New York Times, among other things, and he sent me 6 portraits of Lewis, and this one was abstract, and I called him and said, what's this about? And he said, well, he was committed to abstraction, and I wanted to sort of pay homage to that commitment in the portrait I did of him. And if you squint your eyes for the one of Herb Wheeler, it's clearly a portrait of him, and I took it to be water, and him making a reference to Lewis's interest in water. And this is Lewis's studio. He loved pigeons, he loved plants, and his sense of connection with nature and with formalism carried on to the rest of his life. So this is the studio on Grand Street at the end of his life with his wonderful files, which I've been through, which are so fantastic, and slide collections and flat files. And anyway, I think this says a lot about who he was. So I hope your library has the book for the show because it has a lot of pictures in it. One of my aims in doing the book was to have it be a book that if nobody read a word, they'd be able to look at it and know who this artist was. So there's a whole section on the prints, which has text. There's a section of drawings, which is really like a picture album. It was my most self-indulgent catalog of my entire life. But as you go through it, you can really, I think I succeeded. You don't need to read a word, just look at the pictures and you'll know who he was. So if anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer them, and thank you for coming. How many of you knew of him? That's one of the things.
We have some mics here.
I was in Chicago during Thanksgiving break, and I went to see the exhibit. So that's how I know it.
Ah, so you didn't know till that?
Yeah.
What'd you think?
I liked it.
It's beautiful, isn't it? Yeah. And that's a much smaller exhibit, but I think it really does give the picture. And there were people who saw both the Philadelphia show and the Chicago show who really liked the Chicago show better because the Philadelphia show had cases from his library and archival materials, and it really had a sort of sociological component that I loved. But these people felt that, well, you could concentrate on the paintings better if you just had the paintings. So that's why there's chocolate and vanilla. Yeah.
Well, I was wondering if you could just say a little more about the protest of the Harlem on My Mind show.
Yeah.
If you could just explain that.
There's a complicated, long subject on which several books have been written.
In 2
2 lines. The Harlem on My
Mind. Because I actually don't know the whole story, but.
Well, I mean, the Harlem on My Mind show was basically a documentary photograph show that was put together by a group, as far as I know, of totally white people with no artist input from the Harlem community. And the Harlem community was pretty outraged for good reason. And there is a lot written about it, actually. Bridget Cooks did a dissertation that includes that, but that's what it was. And so it was picketed, and it was really ugly. And it's a long story, but really ugly. Yeah. Anybody else? Well, if you go to Chicago, it's up at the Chicago Cultural Center until, I think, January 7th. Okay.
How did you get interested in his work? You've been looking at it for, I think, 20 years.
Yeah, I got interested in it through the drawings. I mean, I really think the drawings are remarkable, and now that I feel like I know the paintings as well as I know the drawings, I think the drawings as a body of work are more remarkable in the sense that I think nobody does what he does on paper. Whereas the paintings, I mean, I am prejudiced. I think generally drawings are more interesting than anything else, so I have to admit to that. But I just think they're so special. And the more I've looked at him, the more complicated and beautiful the work gets. And the abstractions that I said came from Fogg or something, I mean, they're magical paintings, but they very much grow out of the drawings. And I still don't know how the drawings are made. I mean, I've never looked at a body of work where I had so much trouble knowing what I was looking at. And I think the only way to really figure it out is to do it very closely with paper conservators and do testing. The works on paper are all called oil on paper. They're not oil on paper. And if they are, they're oil with the oil leached out like Degas did, because there's no oil residue on the back of most of them. And his widow told me that he stamped. Well, some of them he stamped, but she didn't know him until the middle 60s, so she doesn't know what he was doing in the 50s. There are masks that he used, so you get really sharp lines. And I think the most unusual paintings depend a lot on what the works on paper were doing. I just think he's remarkable. And as I said, there's still so many questions. I mean, very basic things. He's lauded in Bermuda as a Bermudian artist. And it's always been said that his parents came to America from Bermuda. Well, they did in fact take the ship from Bermuda. We have the ship's log, but I spent 4 days in Bermuda. There is no evidence of them ever living in Bermuda. And his father said he came from St. Kitts. So how they got from St. Kitts to Bermuda, whether they were in Bermuda for 2 hours or 2 weeks or 2 years. So, you know, I mean, the most basic questions are still there. It's, and how he worked and when they were dated, and there's just so much more to be learned, you know. It's like we have a big catalog, a big book, 6 people wrote for it, and I have way more questions now than before I started. I mean, it's amazing. And, you know, I'm done. I'm too old to keep doing it. Someone else has to take it on. And there is one person who's doing a dissertation now, and And I mean, there are so many bodies of work, like the brushstroke work. There could be a show of just those works. There's a kind of black and white brushstroke work that I didn't even show you any slides of. There's a whole group of works by them. There's just so much more to be learned. So, but that was it. It was the works on paper, and then when I did the Bearden show and saw the paintings, and also talking to people, talking to the artists. There's an issue of the International Review of African American Art that was devoted to Lewis entirely. I don't know that they ever did that before, but in there is an interview or a conversation I did with Gilliam Edwards and William T. Williams in 2009, I think. And it was really for me to just talk to them about what they thought. And anybody I talked to. I mean, Jack Whitten talks about how important he was to him, and it's not only African American painters. There are a lot of white painters who, if they knew him, felt the same way, but he wasn't. And it's hard to know why not, in a way, because he was in all these group shows. But I think when he died, he just somehow got underground or something, and because it's so hard to actually get the information, you know, I mean, you got to be nuts to take this one and stay with it. But there were a great group of people working with me on the show, and they really got into it just as much. So it was a real kind of team effort.
In the small, well, in the what you had said initially, it had people thought were puppets, the small figures. What collections are those in?
Oh, they're in the estate. There's so much that's just private. Yeah, they're in the estate.
I mean, those are remarkable.
They're remarkable.
Objects.
And how they're made, they're wild. They're not all in great condition, and Michael Rosenfeld Gallery handles the estate now. And that happened while I was working on the show. I mean, nobody was handling, well, not nobody, Billy Hodges handled aspects of the estate, but didn't handle the estate in that it was all in his hands. But he and Michael Rosenfeld for years have been enthusiasts, but now Michael Rosenfeld formally has the estate.
And do those objects have a little hook in the back? So they're, okay, they
There's-
don't hang on the wall, they're just,
No, we exhibited just the one I showed you when we made a stand for it. No, I mean, and you know, I went through as much material as I could, but maybe somewhere in the archives it says something. I can't say I saw them all. I ran out, you know, you run out of time when you're doing a show. And so I hope somebody goes through more carefully than I did. I got access to them, and that was great, but I didn't have time to do them all. And the same thing with the mask. I mean, it wouldn't even fit over a baby, so it's not a mask. It's funny.
well, thank you so much.
You're very welcome.
I'd love to talk this afternoon.
Do you have time for one more question, Wendy?
Yeah.
Hi, I'm an artist who exhibited at the CK Gallery.
Uh-huh.
And I just wanted to have a sense from you as to the connection that the three of them, three artists who, Bearden and others who put that particular gallery together, and why are they? Just what-
Oh, it was just, you know, it was the same time the Studio Museum in Harlem. It was 1969. It was, there's no place for our young people to exhibit. We need a place for them to exhibit. That's what it was about. What's your name?
I'm James Moncrief.
James?
James Moncrief.
Okay. Yeah, and it was apparently amazing. I don't know if you know Frank Stewart, but he's the person I've heard a lot about Cinque from, who was involved with their photography and all that. Unfortunately, those papers are, as far as I know, for the most part, not around.
I guess just as a quick follow-up, do you see it being really political for them to have done that at that particular time?
I think everything was political, don't you? I think everything was political, but I don't think it was only political. I think it was heartfelt that they knew what problems they had. I mean, Bearden didn't have problems. Bearden went with Cordier Ekstrom in 1950. He He was never without a gallery. But he also, Bearden did a whole body of work that was smaller, less expensive, that he would give to young African American, primarily women, who wanted to be dealers so that they could sell to the community. And I mean, it's a whole body of work that's, you know, and people don't know about it because it wasn't documented the same way the big things that went through Ekstrom were. I mean, there's just so much work to be done. But yeah, I think it was political and I think it was personal, you know. And I don't think they were separable. What do you think?
As someone who sort of benefited from their work, I think there was a moment in time when they were trying very much to give more people access. And it's still something for today.
Absolutely.
So
Absolutely.
that's what I've always applauded them for.
Yeah, yeah. And Lewis was apparently at the heart of any effort in that regard, from what I can tell, and totally. And he didn't suffer fools gladly. Did you know him?
I met him through Bearden and Critchlow.
Uh-huh,
So it was really,
yeah. So when did you show there?
I showed there in, late, like 1985.
Uh-huh. Okay, well, so Lewis was dead by then, and Bearden was
Bearden was,
sickish, but still around, yeah. Well, lucky you.
yeah,
I wish I'd met Bearden.
Bearden was wonderful too.
Yeah, no, I know about him through Frank Stewart also. I mean, Frank Stewart's my guide too. He's a good friend, and that's how I know what I know about
He was
Cinquehaid.
working closely with June Kelly now as well, right?
I don't know that, but I wouldn't be surprised. I don't know that.
So